The wind howled down the mountain like a warning, but Sarah kept walking, her boots crunching through fresh snow, rifle slung across her shoulder and breath misting in the cold. Winter had swallowed the land whole, turning the pines into frozen sentinels and the sky into pewter. She'd gone farther than usual from the cabin, chasing tracks that didn't belong. They were too small for a deer, too clumsy for a fox. Curiosity tugged her forward. She spotted it near a thicket, curled into itself. A bear cub, barely moving, its fur matted with ice and one paw tucked awkwardly under its body. For a moment, all she could hear was its soft, ragged breathing. No mother in sight, no blood trail, no sign of why it had been left behind, just a shivering ball of life too young to survive the night. Sarah lowered her rifle and approached slowly. "Easy now," she whispered, as if the cub understood. It didn't move, didn't growl. It only blinked once, as if too tired to care. Something broke loose inside her then. Not fear, not pity exactly, but recognition. She'd been abandoned once, too, on the edge of something bigger than she could survive alone. Wrapping the cub in her shawl, she carried it back toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier than the snow itself. By the time she reached the porch, the wind had picked up, and the sky had begun spitting snow again. Inside, she stoked the fire high, placing the cub in a basket lined with old blankets. Its sides rose and fell shallowly, but it was alive. That was enough. She stayed up late into the night, feeding it broth from a spoon and watching the shadows shift against the log walls. Around midnight, something made her look out the window. The trees beyond the clearing were silent, unmoving. But she felt it. That prickle at the base of her spine. The sense of being watched. She pulled the curtain shut and checked the rifle, setting it beside the door. Just nerves, she told herself. Just wind and wolves and winter playing tricks. But as she laid down on her cot beside the fire, one hand still hanging over the edge of the cub's basket, the feeling didn't fade. It deepened. And far out beneath the cover of pines, a pair of dark eyes blinked slowly, watching the cabin, the smoke, and the woman who had unknowingly taken in a spirit the forest had not meant to give. The cub stirred just before dawn, letting out a low, unsure whimper that woke Sarah from a shallow sleep. She blinked against the firelight, now reduced to glowing embers, and reached instinctively to touch the creature's soft fur. Warm, still alive. That was something. Outside, the wind had died down, replaced by a strange, almost reverent silence. Sarah stood slowly, wrapped herself in a wool shawl, and stepped onto the porch with her rifle tucked under her arm. The snow had stopped, but the woods had not forgotten what moved through them in the dark. Her eyes drifted over the clearing, and then froze. Tracks, not animal, not hers. A single line of deep, careful footsteps had come from the tree line, curved along the edge of her garden, and stopped just below her window. Then, nothing. No retreat, no shift in direction. Whoever it was had stood there, watching her through the glass while she slept. She gripped the rifle tighter, heart thudding low and heavy in her chest. Could have been a trapper, maybe even a thief. But there were no boots in those prints, just bare soles pressed deep into the snow, toes spread like the feet of someone who had known the earth longer than shoes. Apache. She knew the signs. She'd lived near their borders long enough to read the signs they didn't bother hiding. This one hadn't meant to be seen. But he wanted her to know he'd been here. She turned slowly and went back inside, bolting the door behind her. The cub looked up at her with wide, unknowing eyes. "What did I bring home?" she murmured. The fire hissed as she fed it new logs, then pulled a pot of water to boil. Her hands trembled only slightly, not from fear, but from a strange current of anticipation. The Apaches didn't waste time on outsiders unless something sacred had been crossed or returned. She wrapped the cub again, more tightly this time, and moved it closer to the hearth. The tiny thing whimpered and nestled in, unaware of the stir its presence had caused. As the day wore on, Sarah stayed alert. She didn't step outside again. She watched through the slats in the window, listening for the crunch of snow, the rustle of pine needles, anything. But the forest stayed still. Yet she knew that somewhere out there, he was watching her still. Not as a threat, not yet, but as a question. And sooner or later, he would want an answer. By the third day, Sarah's nerves had settled into something stranger. Expectation. The tracks had disappeared beneath fresh snow, but the feeling hadn't. That pressure in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. The cub was healing fast, eating from her hand now, even toddling a few steps on its bandaged paw. But with every movement it made, every tiny growl or blink of sleepy eyes, Sarah felt the presence out there draw tighter. Whoever the scout was, he hadn't come back. Not in a way she could see. But she felt him in the way the birds went silent near dusk, in the untouched deer prints that vanished just past her woodpile. In the single pine cone she found resting gently on her porch rail. Placed, not dropped. A message. She sat on the cabin step that evening with her rifle across her knees, the cub nestled in the crook of her arm like a stubborn child. Snow fell slow and soft, catching in her lashes. "I don't know what you want," she said to the woods, voice low and even. "But if it's the cub, you'll have to come ask for him." It wasn't a challenge. It was truth. She'd never stolen from the forest, never taken more than she needed. But if this creature belonged to someone, or something, she needed to know. She couldn't keep feeding what wasn't hers. That night she left the door unbolted. Just once. She set the rifle beside her cot, stoked the fire high, and curled against the cub's warmth. The sleep that came was light and fractured, haunted by dreams of eyes in the dark and a voice she didn't understand murmuring in a language older than the land. When she awoke, the fire was low, and someone had been inside. She knew by the scent first, smoke and pine and leather, and the tracks, just two of them, barefoot, just inside the door, no farther. A mark had been etched into the ash beside the hearth. A single spiral, not cut with a blade, but drawn with a fingertip, careful and deliberate. She stared at it for a long time before touching it. Warm, fresh. The cub stirred, blinking up at her as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The scout had come, had seen her, had seen the cub, and he'd left not in anger, but in acknowledgement. Whatever debt had been owed, this was just the beginning. Sarah sat beside the hearth for what felt like hours, her fingertips brushing over the spiral etched into the cooled ash. It wasn't a warning. It didn't carry the sharpness of threat. No, it felt older, softer, like a sign placed not to scare but to speak. A mark of seeing, of respect. She'd seen a symbol like it once before, years ago, carved faintly into a medicine pouch traded at the edge of Apache territory. An elder had told her then that spirals weren't just shapes. They were stories, life circling back, debts paid, promises remembered. She hadn't understood it then. Now her cabin felt folded into something larger than her quiet life. The cub snuffled in its blanket, stretching its paw gingerly, healing fast, faster than she expected. As if watched over, she opened the door slowly, not to check for danger, but to greet whatever might still be listening. Snow had fallen again during the night, but not enough to hide the new prints. Just a single pair leading away into the trees. And something else. A bundle. She stepped out, breath white in the morning air, and crouched beside the offering laid gently against the woodpile. A piece of jerky wrapped in deerskin, a woven bracelet of red and black thread, and a single hawk feather. Gifts. Her fingers trembled as she picked them up. Not random objects, symbols, food for strength, thread for protection, feather for vision. The Apache brave wasn't just watching. He was recognizing her. She looked out towards the trees and whispered, "I see you too." The forest did not answer, but it didn't need to. That day, she hung the bracelet from the corner post of her porch, where the sun could catch its threads. She tied the feather near the hearth, where the cub slept, as a silent promise that it was no longer alone. That night she did not bolt the door. She did not keep the rifle beside her bed. Instead, she sat on the porch under the moonlight, a mug of warm broth in her hands, waiting, not in fear, but in welcome. Somewhere in those woods was a man who had walked the snow barefoot to mark her floor with a spiral of memory. She didn't know his name, didn't know his face, but he had given her a sign, and she had answered. And in the stillness between them, something old and powerful stirred. Not danger, not romance, not yet, just the beginning of trust. And in a world this harsh, trust was its own kind of miracle. The days that followed moved with an eerie quiet, as though the forest itself held its breath. Sarah went about her tasks with a strange rhythm now, chopping wood, boiling stew, tending the cub, but always with one eye on the tree line. No more footprints appeared, no more bundles or symbols, but the air had shifted. The stillness was not emptiness, it was presence. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge and turned the snow to fire, she heard it, distant, low and steady. A drum, not close enough to alarm, but close enough to be known. It came from deep in the pines, one long beat followed by silence, then another. A pattern, intentional. Her heart thudded in answer, not from fear, but from something ancient in her bones that recognized the sound. The cub, now strong enough to walk without wobbling, stood alert at the sound, ears perked. It did not cower, it did not growl, it simply listened, as if the drum spoke a language it knew from birth. Sarah stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting her cheeks. The drumbeat continued, 3 times, then silence. Then again. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm sink in. A call. Not to arms, not to war, to witness. That night she did not sleep. She laid a second blanket out by the fire and left the door cracked open, the same way one leaves a lantern lit on the trail for a traveler yet to come. At midnight, the wind stirred and carried with it a sound not of footsteps, but of motion. Silent, deliberate, near. She didn't rise, didn't reach for her weapon. Instead, she waited. The cub lifted its head, nose twitching, then padded softly to the door and sat, as if waiting too. Then came a shadow, not crashing through the woods but materializing from them. A tall figure, lean and wrapped in dark hides, face half covered in war paint, eyes catching the firelight with no threat, only knowing. The Apache scout, the one who had drawn the spiral. He didn't speak, didn't step inside. He looked only at the cub, then at Sarah. And slowly he placed a palm to his chest and nodded once, a gesture of thanks, of return. Then he stepped back into the shadows and vanished. She stood in the doorway long after he was gone, her breath rising like smoke in the moonlight, her chest full of something she hadn't felt in years, Connection. The drumbeat still echoed in her bones. And she knew now the story had truly begun. Her heart thudded in answer, not from fear, but from something ancient in her bones that recognized the sound. The cub, now strong enough to walk without wobbling, stood alert at the sound, ears perked. It did not cower, it did not growl, it simply listened, as if the drum spoke a language it knew from birth. Sarah stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting her cheeks. The drumbeat continued, 3 times, then silence. Then again. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm sink in. A call. Not to arms, not to war, to witness. That night she did not sleep. She laid a second blanket out by the fire and left the door cracked open, the same way one leaves a lantern lit on the trail for a traveler yet to come. At midnight, the wind stirred and carried with it a sound not of footsteps, but of motion. Silent, deliberate, near. She didn't rise, didn't reach for her weapon. Instead, she waited. The cub lifted its head, nose twitching, then padded softly to the door and sat, as if waiting too. Then came a shadow, not crashing through the woods but materializing from them. A tall figure, lean and wrapped in dark hides, face half covered in war paint, eyes catching the firelight with no threat, only knowing. The Apache scout, the one who had drawn the spiral. He didn't speak, didn't step inside. He looked only at the cub, then at Sarah. And slowly he placed a palm to his chest and nodded once, a gesture of thanks, of return. Then he stepped back into the shadows and vanished. She stood in the doorway long after he was gone, her breath rising like smoke in the moonlight, her chest full of something she hadn't felt in years. Connection. The drumbeat still echoed in her bones. And she knew now the story had truly begun.
That night, the wind came first, sharp, howling, carrying flakes like blades through the dark. Sarah had barely sealed the shutters and banked the fire when the first real wave of snow slammed against the cabin, rattling the walls like fists. The bear cub curled against her feet, whimpering softly, but she whispered calm into its ear and wrapped them both tighter in blankets. Outside, the world vanished, white and gray, blinding and endless. She knew this kind of storm. It was the kind settlers feared most. The kind that buried trails, collapsed roofs, stole breath from lungs. But she'd weathered storms before. What unsettled her now wasn't the wind or cold. It was what lay just beyond her walls. Him, the scout. Somewhere out there, cloaked in furs, skin painted, walking with the quiet of old ghosts. She stared into the fire, heart heavy. He had warned her. That was more than most had done in her life. As the wind screamed louder, a gust cracked open the cabin's side door. Snow flew in and Sarah lunged to bar it when she saw the figure standing there, soaked, silent, eyes sharp even in the stormlight. The Apache. She froze, but he didn't enter. He reached out with one hand and gently pushed the door shut again from outside, then pointed to the edge of her cabin's roof. The wind had begun tearing at it. "Snow too heavy," he said, voice low and sure. "If it breaks, you freeze." She grabbed her coat without thinking, nodding. Together, in that blizzard they worked, him climbing the low porch roof to clear the drifts, her holding the ladder steady with numbed fingers. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The wind was their language now. By the time the roof was safe, her limbs shook and her breath came in gasps. She turned to thank him, but he was already gone, vanished into the white as though the storm had swallowed him whole. Back inside, she collapsed beside the fire, the cub nestled in her lap. The wind raged on, but something inside her had quieted. She had never asked for this life, this wild land, this strange companionship. But it had come to her like snow on pine branches, slow and soft, until one day the world looked entirely different. She wrapped herself in his old coat, the one he had left beside her door days before, and for the first time since the frost had settled, she slept without dreaming. Because even in the storm, she was no longer unknown. She was seen.
The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 4th, Sarah woke to silence so deep it rang in her ears. The cabin was still, the fire low, the bear cub stretched beside her with its paws twitching in a dream. When she pushed open the door, light spilled in like a blessing. The world outside had turned to glass, ice-laced trees shimmering under a sky so blue it felt like spring had snuck in early. Everything was coated in frost, but there was peace now, not peril. And carved into the thick snow before her cabin door were footprints, not just the light, clever prints of the Apache scout, but the deep, heavier tracks of horses. She followed them, not out of fear, but because she trusted the trail now. It led her to the edge of the pines where the land opened toward the hills, and there, in a clearing, stood them. 6 riders, Apache all, dressed in winter hides, their horses calm, their gazes steady. At their center was the scout. He dismounted as she approached, holding something wrapped in cloth. She stopped a few paces away, unsure. He extended the bundle toward her. "For the cub," he said simply. Inside was a carved wooden bowl, a small blanket of buffalo wool, and a stone with the same sunburst symbol she had seen earlier etched into its face. "What is this?" she asked softly. He didn't smile, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Proof." "Of what?" "That you belong," he said, "that the story is shared now." She blinked, the wind tugging at her coat, the snow beneath her boots creaking gently. She looked past him, at the riders who had brought no weapons, only quiet eyes. "He was your brother," she said, barely more than a whisper. The scout didn't answer with words, but he placed his palm again over his chest. "He walks with the bear now," he said at last. "You carried him without knowing." Sarah's throat tightened. She thought of the cub, the strange calm it carried, the way it had never acted wild, only watchful, almost human in its mourning. She looked down at the stone in her hand, then back at the man before her. "What do I do now?" The scout gestured towards the forest. "Spring is near. Teach him the world. Let him go when he's ready. And remember, you were chosen, not by us, but by what remains." Then he mounted his horse, nodded once, and turned back toward the mountains. The riders followed, disappearing into the trees like smoke, and Sarah stood in the sunlit clearing, heart full, knowing she would never be the same. Days passed, and the snow softened under the early kiss of spring. The trees dripped steadily, tiny rivulets forming along the path behind the cabin, and the bear cub, stronger now, heavier, had begun venturing beyond the threshold without fear. Sarah watched him with equal parts pride and ache. He would outgrow this place soon. Already he moved with more confidence, sniffing at buds breaking through the thawed earth, testing his claws on bark and shadow. She no longer called him back. The cub had to learn the wild again, not just survive it, but belong to it. She spent her mornings walking with him, retracing the tracks the scout had left, reading signs he taught her without ever speaking. A bent branch, a hollow tree, a feather tucked in snow. Every day she learned something new, not just about the forest, but about herself. She was no longer the woman who had clung to silence and routine like a shield. She was something else now, someone shaped by snow and smoke and the watchful eyes of a people who had once been strangers. And then, One morning she found the cub standing at the edge of the creek where she'd first spotted him. He looked back at her with those deep brown eyes. Not afraid, but ready. She didn't say a word, just nodded once. He crossed the creek without hesitation, vanishing into the trees with a final flick of his ear. She stayed there a long while, letting the quiet settle, letting herself feel the weight of goodbye. But it didn't crush her. It steadied her. Because love, she realized, wasn't in the keeping. It was in the letting go. That evening she sat by the hearth and carved the sunburst symbol again, this time not into wood, but into the cabin door. A sign. A story etched into the bones of the place that had changed her. She wasn't sure what would come next. Spring would bring more travelers, more change. But she wasn't hiding anymore. That night she left the door unlatched, just slightly, a gesture that said, "You may come. You are welcome." And when she lay down to sleep, the wind outside was gentle, no longer howling but humming like a song remembered. She smiled in the dark, her hand still resting over the scout's stone, and whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to everything. The forest, the cub, the tribe, the story. Because now it was hers, too." The final snow melted under the hush of dawn, and Sarah stood barefoot at the cabin's edge, feeling the thawed earth beneath her toes. In her hand was the carved stone, warm from her palm, its sunburst symbol smoothed by her fingers over countless nights. The bear cub had not returned. And yet the clearing felt full, as though his spirit lingered in the wind, in the trees, in the silence that now comforted instead of haunted. She had spent the last week tending the land around her, clearing branches, fixing the gate, planting the first seeds since the frost. It wasn't for survival. It was for legacy, for roots. And one evening, as golden light pooled across the clearing, she heard hooves again. Not hurried, not menacing, just steady. She turned, expecting the Apache scout, but it was a woman this time, older, wrapped in leather and beads, her eyes sharp and kind. She rode a painted mare and carried a satchel slung low. "You're the one who stayed with the cub," the woman said simply. Sarah nodded. "He chose me." The woman dismounted, her gaze sweeping the land. "Then we're kin now." She handed Sarah the satchel. Inside were seeds. Corn, beans, squash, bundled herbs, dried berries, a gesture not of charity but of belonging. "The scout said you listen. The land needs more of that." They sat on the porch for hours, trading stories in soft voices. Sarah spoke little, but the woman didn't mind. She seemed to understand the language of silence just as deeply. Before leaving, the woman pressed her forehead gently to Sarah's. "You gave something without knowing. That matters." And then she was gone. Another spirit passing through, another thread in a growing web Sarah hadn't meant to weave, but now could never untangle from. That night, Sarah lit a fire not out of need, but ceremony. She hung the sunburst stone above the hearth and placed the carved bowl near the door. She wasn't waiting for the cub to return anymore. She was preparing for others, for stories yet to come. At dusk, as the shadows stretched long and gentle, she carved something new into the beam above her cabin door. Just one word. Welcome. The wind caught it, lifted it, and carried it beyond the pines. She smiled. Her cabin wasn't just shelter now, it was sanctuary. And though her name might never be written in books or sung in songs, the story of the woman who took in a bear cub and listened to the snow would live in whispers, in roots, in stars. And that, she thought, was more than enough.